It is a single piece of high-carbon steel, heavy-bellied and recurved, measuring exactly 18 inches from pommel to tip. It is not balanced for the delicate fencing movements of a European saber, nor is it designed for the piercing thrusts of a bayonet. Its weight is concentrated in the curve of the blade, transforming a simple swing of the arm into a mechanical force capable of severing a human limb with a single, fluid motion. At the base of the blade, near the handle, there is a small, cow hoof-shaped notch called a cowdy. It serves a dual purpose. It prevents blood from running down the blade onto the hilt during combat, keeping the grip firm, and it represents the footprint of the cow, a sacred symbol of the culture from which this blade was born. It is called the Kukri. In the late 18th century, the British East India Company was the most powerful corporate entity on the planet. It was a machine of global expansion, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, and protected by a military doctrine that emphasized disciplined musketry, massed artillery, and the rigid hierarchy of the British officer class. To the administrators in Calcutta, the expansion into the foothills of the Himalayas was a logical necessity for trade. They viewed the Gurkha kingdom of Nepal as a minor regional obstacle, a primitive, mountain-dwelling people who would surely crumble before the technological and organizational superiority of the British Empire. The British measured power in the number of bayonets in a line and the weight of broadsides from their ships. The Gurkhas measured power in the silence of the mountain passes and the cold edge of the Kukri. What followed was not the easy conquest the British had predicted, but a collision of philosophies that would permanently alter the DNA of the British military. To understand the Gurkha, one must first understand the environment that forges them. Nepal is a landscape defined by verticality. Life in the middle hills and the high Himalayas is a continuous struggle against gravity. Every calorie earned requires a physical investment that would break a lowland farmer. A child in a Gurkha village does not walk, he climbs. He carries water, wood, and crops in a wicker basket called a doko, secured by a strap across his forehead. By the age of 10, his lung capacity, his bone density, and his psychological threshold for physical suffering are already beyond the reach of a professional Western soldier. In 1814, when the Anglo-Nepalese War began, the British sent 30,000 troops into the mountains. They expected a standard campaign. They met an enemy that did not fight by the rules of the European Enlightenment. The Gurkhas did not retreat when faced with superior numbers. They did not break when artillery pounded their stone forts. Instead, they waited until the British were exhausted by the climb, and then they emerged from the mist with the Kukri. The British soldiers, many of whom were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, reported a new kind of fear. It was not the fear of being shot from a distance, but the fear of a silent, intimate violence. They watched as Gurkha warriors charged into the teeth of musket fire, ignoring their wounds, to close the distance where the Kukri could do its work. The British military machine, designed for the open plains of the Low Countries, found itself paralyzed in the jagged terrain of the Himalayas. If you are beginning to appreciate the tactical nuances and the historical weight of this elite brotherhood, please consider subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications. We explore the cold, objective realities of military history, focusing on the units that redefined the limits of human endurance. If you find this level of analysis valuable, leaving a like helps us surface these stories for a wider audience.
In the comments, I would be interested to read your perspective. Is a soldier born of a harsh environment inherently superior to one created by a modern training system? Your insights help shape our future investigations. The British military establishment, in a rare moment of institutional humility, recognized that they were not facing a primitive enemy, but a superior warrior culture. The commanding officer of the British forces, General David Ochterlony, noted in his dispatches that the Gurkhas possessed a fidelity and a bravery that he had never encountered in any other theatre.
The war ended in 1816 with the Treaty of Sugauli. But the conclusion was not a standard peace. It was a transition. The British, realizing they could not conquer the Gurkhas, did something unprecedented in the history of the empire. They invited their enemy to join them. This was the birth of the Gurkha Brigade. It was an admission that the industrialized British machine needed the mountain-hardened individual to survive in the rugged frontiers of Asia. But for the Gurkha, joining the British army was not a surrender, it was a social contract. They would lend their legendary discipline and their Kukri to the empire, and in return, they would gain a prestige that would elevate their families in the social hierarchy of Nepal. This contract created a recruitment process that is still, 200 years later, the most competitive and grueling in the world. Every year, thousands of young men in the hills of Nepal begin a journey toward a single objective, the British Gurkha selection. For a boy from a remote village in the Annapurna or Everest regions, becoming a Gurkha is the only escape from a life of subsistence farming. It is a chance to earn a pension that will support 3 generations of his family. But the path to the Kukri is designed to filter out everything but absolute perfection.
The selection begins in the villages, where former Gurkhas, known as Galawalas, scout for the most promising candidates. These boys must meet strict physical requirements: height, chest expansion, and dental health. But the true test is the Doko race. The Doko race is a 3-mile climb up a steep mountain ridge. Each candidate must carry a Doko basket loaded with 25 kilograms of rocks. They must complete the climb in under 46 minutes. In the thin air of the Himalayas, this is a feat of cardiovascular and muscular endurance that defies the standards of Western special operations. Many candidates collapse. Some suffer permanent injury. But those who finish are the raw material from which the silent edge is forged. Out of 25,000 applicants, only about 200 are selected for the British Army each year. This is a pass rate of less than 1%. When a young man finally boards the plane for the training center in the United Kingdom, he is already part of the most elite physical 1% of his nation. The training he undergoes in Britain is an exercise in cultural and tactical synchronization. He is taught to operate the most advanced weapons in the British arsenal: the SA-80 assault rifle, night vision systems, and encrypted communications. He is taught the English language and the history of the regiments he is joining. But beneath the modern equipment, the fundamental essence of the Gurkha remains unchanged. He is still the boy from the mountains. He still carries the puko, or rather, its Nepalese equivalent, the Kukri. During the First World War, the Gurkhas were deployed to the mud of the Western Front. It was an environment that should have negated their mountain-bred advantages. The trenches were cold, damp, and dominated by heavy artillery and machine guns. The German military, the most professional army in Europe, viewed the arrival of these short, dark men from the east with initial curiosity. That curiosity turned to terror in the winter of 1914. The Gurkhas found that the static nature of trench warfare was perfect for their brand of silent, nighttime raiding. They would crawl across no man's land in the dead of night, moving with a silence that the British and German troops found incomprehensible. They would slip into the German trenches, often ignoring their rifles entirely. The Germans began to find their sentries dead, not from bullets, but from the massive curved wounds of the Kukri. The Gurkhas developed a terrifying psychological tactic. They would enter a trench and kill every second man in a line, leaving the survivors to wake up next to their decapitated comrades. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the calculated application of psychological disruption. They wanted the enemy to fear the silence. They wanted them to know that the machine gun nest and the barbed wire were no protection against a man with a knife and the patience of a mountain predator. This highlights the core of the Gurkha philosophy. The Kukri is not just a backup weapon, it is a psychological force multiplier. In the mind of the Gurkha, the rifle is a
tool for the distance, but the Kukri is the manifestation of his identity. One of the most famous stories from the First World War involves a Gurkha named Kulbir Thapa. During the Battle of Loos in 1915, Thapa found himself alone in a German trench. He was wounded, but he managed to find a wounded British soldier from the Leicestershire Regiment. Instead of leaving him, Thapa carried the British soldier through the German lines under heavy fire. But he didn't stop there. He went back into the German trench twice more to rescue 2 of his fellow Gurkhas. When he was finally awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration for valour in the British Empire, the citation noted his total disregard for his own safety. But for the Gurkha, this was not disregard, it was the fulfillment of the contract. You do not leave your brother. You do not fear the fire. You do what the mountain has trained you to do. You endure. As the war progressed, the myth of the Gurkha grew. The British commanders realized that these men could be used as the ultimate shock troops. They were sent to Gallipoli, where they climbed the jagged cliffs of Sari Bair under a hail of Turkish fire, reaching the heights that the regular British and Australian units could not. They were sent to Mesopotamia and Palestine. In every theatre, the result was the same. The Gurkhas adapted to the heat, the cold, and the disease. They fought with a stoicism that often unnerved their own officers. But the most significant transformation was happening within the Gurkhas themselves. They were no longer just mountain boys. They were the silent edge of a global empire. They had learned to live in 2 worlds, the ancient world of the Himalayan village and the modern world of industrial warfare. The Kukri hanging on their belts was the bridge between these 2 worlds. It was the physical reminder that no matter how much technology was layered onto the soldier, the gas masks, the steel helmets, the heavy machine guns, the final outcome of the battle would always be determined by the man who was willing to get close enough to see the enemy's eyes. If you are a veteran or currently serving in the military, I would be honored to hear about your experiences training with or alongside the Gurkhas. Their reputation is legendary, but the personal stories of their discipline and their unique sense of humor often provide the most profound insights. Your engagement, likes, comments, and shares allows us to continue this rigorous, flagship-level documentation of military history. As we conclude this first part of our analysis, we leave the Gurkhas in the aftermath of the Great War. They have proven themselves on the global stage. They have earned the respect of their allies and the terror of their enemies. But the world is about to change. The technology of war is about to become even more devastating, and the Gurkhas will be faced with a new kind of conflict, one that will test their legendary loyalty to the breaking point. The Kukri is sharp, but the whetstone of the 20th century is about to become much harder. Stay with us for part 2, where we go deep into the jungles of Burma and the mountains of Italy, exploring the Gurkhas' role in the Second World War and the secret of their unbreakable morale. The edge is silent, but its impact is forever. To maintain the edge of a Kukri, a Gurkha carries 2 smaller knives in the back of the leather scabbard. One is the kada, a small, sharp utility knife used for skinning game or fine carving. The other is the chakmak, a blunt piece of high-carbon steel used for stroking the blade to realign its microscopic teeth and for striking sparks against flint to start a fire. Together, these 3 tools represent the complete survival kit of the mountain soldier. But the chakmak, the sharpener, carries a deeper symbolic weight. It is the reminder that even the most lethal edge will dull without constant, disciplined maintenance. In 1939, as the second global conflict of the century ignited, the British Empire was a machine in a state of advanced mechanical fatigue. Its naval supremacy was being challenged by the U-boat, its air defense was stretched to the limit, and its land forces were struggling to transition from the horse-drawn logistics of the 19th century to the mechanized, lightning-fast blitzkrieg of the 20th. The British military was a complex, fragile ecosystem of technology and bureaucracy. The Gurkha, however, was the chakmak of the empire. In a war that would be defined by massive armored movements and industrial-scale aerial bombardment, the Gurkha remained the sharpener, the human element that provided the raw, gritty reliability the machine lacked. The expansion of the Gurkha regiments was rapid. By 1945, over 250,000 Gurkhas were serving in 40 battalions. They were no longer just the frontier police. They were the strategic reserve of a desperate global power. They were deployed across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and most crucially, the jungles of Southeast Asia. In the North African desert, the Gurkhas encountered a war of total visibility. Unlike the mists of the Himalayas or the mud of the Western Front, the desert offered no shadows. It was a landscape of sand and steel, dominated by the panzer divisions of Erwin Rommel. Here, the British military doctrine relied on the box formation, static defensive positions protected by minefields and anti-tank guns. The Gurkhas, specifically the 2nd, 5th, and 7th regiments, found themselves in the middle of this mechanized attrition. At the Battle of El Alamein, they were tasked with clearing the deep minefields under the cover of darkness. It was a mission that required a psychological composure that defies modern description. They moved on their hands and knees, probing the sand with bayonets and kukris, listening for the faint metallic click of a pressure plate, while the night sky above them was illuminated by the traces of 2 million shells. When the breakthrough occurred, the Gurkhas were used to pursue the retreating Axis forces. In the narrow wadis and rocky outcrops of Tunisia, the desert war became intimate again. The German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, were among the most elite soldiers in the world, trained in the same aggressive small unit tactics as the Gurkhas. The collision between these two elite forces was a study in contrasts. The German paratrooper was the pinnacle of the European industrial warrior, highly technical, heavily armed, and fueled by a fanatic ideology. The Gurkha was the pinnacle of the natural warrior, relying on his physiology, his silence, and his ancient blade. In the night raids on the hills of Enfidaville, the Germans learned what the Turks had learned at Gallipoli, that no amount of automatic fire can stop a man who has decided he is already within striking distance. If you appreciate this granular, objective look at the collision of military cultures and the evolution of combat psychology, please consider subscribing to the channel. We go beyond the superficial history to analyze the systems and individuals that define the sharp end of conflict. Leaving a like helps us maintain the production quality of these hour-long documentaries. In the comments, I would be interested in your thoughts. Does a soldier's loyalty to a foreign empire enhance or complicate his effectiveness on the battlefield? As the war moved into Italy in 1944, the Gurkhas were faced with a landscape that was a haunting reflection of their homeland. The Apennine Mountains and the heights of Monte Cassino were a vertical battlefield. Monte Cassino was the anchor of the German Gustav Line, a mountain fortress that had paralyzed the Allied advance toward Rome for months. The Americans, the Free French, and the regular British divisions had all attempted to take the heights and failed, suffering catastrophic casualties under the accurate fire of German mountain troops. The Gurkhas of the 9th Regiment were ordered to take Hangman's Hill, a jagged outcrop directly below the ruins of the Cassino Monastery. To reach it, they had to climb a vertical slope under continuous observation. They carried their rations, their ammunition, and their casualties on their backs, moving through the freezing rain and the jagged limestone. For 9 days, the Gurkhas held Hangman's Hill in total isolation. They were cut off from their supply lines. They survived on snow and dry biscuits. When they ran out of ammunition, they didn't surrender. They waited in their stone scrapes with their kukris. When the order finally came to withdraw, they glided back down the mountain in the middle of a blizzard, leaving the Germans wondering how a force that had been bombed and shelled for a week was still capable of moving with such fluid grace. But while the war in Italy was a test of endurance, the war in Burma was a descent into the primordial. The Burma campaign, often called the Forgotten War, was the longest and most brutal theatre of the Second World War for the British Empire. It was fought in a landscape of triple canopy jungle, malarial swamps, and monsoon rains that lasted for 6 months of the year. It was an environment where the industrial machine failed completely. Tanks bogged down in the mud. Radios rotted in the humidity. Aircraft could not find targets through the dense green roof of the forest. In Burma, the British military met an enemy that had mastered the jungle, the Imperial Japanese Army. The Japanese soldier was indoctrinated with the code of Bushido. He was a master of infiltration, night fighting, and psychological warfare. The Japanese had humiliated the British in Singapore and Malaya, convincing the world that they were the invincibles of the jungle. The British command realized that to defeat the Japanese, they had to stop fighting a conventional, road-bound war. They had to move into the deep jungle. They had to become more primitive and more lethal than the enemy. They turned to the Gurkhas. In the Burmese jungle, the Kukri returned to its primal state. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a survival tool. The Gurkhas used it to cut bashes, shelters made of bamboo and palm leaves. They used it to clear paths through vegetation so thick that a man could only move a mile in a day. They used it to build punji traps and to silent kill Japanese sentries in the dense undergrowth.
The Japanese soldier, who prided himself on his own blade culture, the katana, found himself facing a weapon that was perfectly adapted for the confined spaces of the jungle. The katana is a weapon of the open air, requiring space for its long, elegant arcs. The kukri is a weapon of the shadows. Its weight-forward design allows for a devastating strike in a space no wider than a man's shoulders. The psychological war in Burma was absolute. The Japanese would use jitta parties, small groups that would scream, fire crackers, and move through the brush at night to keep the British troops from sleeping, eventually driving them to a state of nervous collapse. The Gurkhas responded with a silence that was even more terrifying. They would slip out of their perimeters in pairs, moving through the pitch-black jungle using their sense of smell and touch. They would enter the Japanese camps, identify the officers by the feel of their boots or the scent of their hair oil, and execute them in their sleep. They would then vanish back into the darkness. The Japanese began to fear the little men in the green hats. They realized that the Gurkha was not a colonial conscript. He was a natural predator who viewed the jungle not as a green hell, but as his private hunting ground. This leads us to the Chindit operations, led by the eccentric and visionary General Ord Wingate. The Chindits were long-range penetration groups, thousands of soldiers, including multiple Gurkha battalions, who were inserted by glider or on foot deep behind Japanese lines. The mission of the Chindits was to sever the Japanese supply lines to the front at Imphal and Kohima. They lived in the jungle for months at a time, supplied entirely by airdrops. They suffered from dysentery, malaria, and starvation. Many men lost 40% of their body weight. In this environment of total physical degradation, the Gurkhas' cultural resilience became the strategic anchor of the mission.
While the regular British troops struggled with the psychological isolation of the deep jungle, the Gurkhas maintained their discipline and their humor. They viewed the suffering as a part of the contract. At the Battle of Kohima, often called the Stalingrad of the East, the Gurkhas fought in what was effectively a hand-to-hand struggle for a single hilltop garden. The fighting was so close that the two sides were throwing grenades across the width of a tennis court. It was here, in the final desperate struggle of the Burma campaign, that the Gurkha proved the industrial machine of Japan could be broken by the individual blade. The Gurkha of 1945 was a fundamentally different being than the boy who had run the Doko race in the hills of Nepal. He had fought across 3 continents. He had seen the failure of the empire's technology and the triumph of its human spirit. He had earned more Victoria Crosses in the Burma campaign than any other single unit in the British military. But as the war ended, the Gurkha was faced with the most difficult sharpening of all. The chakmak of the empire was about to be used against the heart of the empire itself. The year 1947 brought the partition of India. The British were leaving. The empire was being dismantled. The Gurkha Brigade, which had served the British Crown for 130 years, was to be split. 6 regiments would go to the newly independent Indian Army. 4 would remain with the British. For the individual Gurkha, this was a crisis of identity. Their loyalty was to their officers, their regiment, and the salt they had eaten. Now they were being asked to choose between a fading colonial power and a new, uncertain nation. If you are finding this investigation into the transition from a global empire to a modern special operations force compelling, please ensure you are subscribed and have liked the video. We strive to provide a flagship-level analysis that respects the complexity of these historical transformations.
In the comments, I would be interested to hear, can a warrior's spirit survive the death of the institution he was trained to protect? The transition was painful. Thousands of Gurkhas had to decide their future in a matter of weeks. Some chose to stay with the British, moving their families to the jungles of Malaya or the barracks of Hong Kong. Others chose to join the new Indian Army, continuing their service in the familiar mountains of the Himalayas. The silent edge was being divided. But the philosophy of the Gurkha, the reliance on the individual, the mastery of the environment, and the cold discipline of the Kukri was about to enter its most sophisticated phase. The Cold War was beginning. The era of the Big War was over, replaced by the era of the Small War, insurgencies, jungle skirmishes, and shadow conflicts. This was the environment for which the Gurkha had been evolving for a century. In Part 3, we will follow the Gurkhas into the Malayan emergency and the jungles of Borneo, where they would define the modern doctrine of counterinsurgency and save a nation from collapse. We will see the birth of the Gurkha Independent Parachute Company and the secret operations of the cross-border scouts. The machine is changing, but the blade remains. The most dangerous years are still to come. Stay with us. In the high-altitude villages of the Gurkha district, there is a tradition that a Gurkha never draws his kukri unless he intends to draw blood. While largely a myth popularized for Western tourists, it masks a deeper, colder truth about the discipline of the mountain soldier. The blade is not a toy. It is a commitment. Once it leaves the sheath, the situation has escalated beyond the reach of diplomacy, beyond the reach of words, into the realm of absolute consequence. In June 1948, the British Empire found itself entering exactly such a realm in the rubber plantations and primary jungles of the Malay Peninsula. The conflict was officially designated as the Malayan Emergency. To the bureaucrats in London, the word emergency was a legal fiction designed to ensure that Lloyd's of London would continue to pay out insurance claims for the plantation owners. But to the soldiers on the ground, it was a brutal 12-year war of attrition against the Malayan Races Liberation Army, MRLA, highly disciplined communist guerrillas who had spent years fighting the Japanese and had now turned their sights on the British. The British military initially responded with the heavy-handed logic of the Second World War. They sent conventional infantry battalions into the jungle in large, noisy sweeps. They relied on armored cars and road-bound logistics. They attempted to clear the jungle as if it were a European forest. The results were catastrophic. The communist terrorists, or CTs, simply vanished into the limestone caves and the dense dipterocarp forests. They chose the time and place of every engagement, ambushing British convoys and disappearing before the artillery could be brought to bear. The British industrial machine was punching at smoke. The Gurkhas, however, did not try to clear the jungle. They moved into it. The 2nd, 6th, 7th, and 10th Gurkha Rifles were deployed to the green hell of Malaya with a fundamental advantage. They were not afraid of the shadows. While the regular British conscripts found the jungle claustrophobic and terrifying,
The Gurkhas viewed it as an extension of the Himalayan foothills, thick, vertical, and full of tactical opportunities. They abandoned the conventional doctrine of the company sweep. Instead, they operated in small, self-sufficient patrols of 4 to 6 men. They lived in the jungle for 30 days at a time, carrying their rations in bamboo tubes and sleeping in bashes that left no trace on the forest floor. They stopped using radios during the approach to avoid electronic detection. They became the silent edge once again.
This was the birth of the modern counter-insurgency, coin doctrine. The man who orchestrated this shift was General Sir Gerald Templar. He famously stated that the answer to the insurgency lay not in pouring more troops into the jungle, but in the hearts and minds of the people. But Templar also knew that to win the hearts and minds, you had to first cut the throat of the insurgency. The Gurkhas were his primary instrument for the latter. If you are beginning to see the patterns of asymmetric warfare and the evolution of special operations in these narratives, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We analyze these conflicts with a cold, objective lens, stripping away the noise to find the fundamental principles of combat. In the comments, I would be interested in your analysis. Can a modern army win a war without the hearts and minds of the local population? Or is firepower always a secondary factor in an insurgency? Your engagement helps us continue producing these detail-rich, flagship-level documentaries. In the deep jungle of Malaya, the Gurkhas practiced the art of the static ambush. It was a test of patience that would have broken a Western soldier. A 4-man Gurkha team would identify a jungle trail used by the CTs to move supplies. They would position themselves in the undergrowth, often less than 5 meters from the path. And then they would wait. They would stay motionless for 48, 72, sometimes 96 hours. They did not speak. They did not smoke. They did not swat at the swarms of leeches and mosquitoes that fed on them. They ate cold rations and urinated where they sat. They waited for the moment when the lead scout at the CTs would round the bend, confident in his own mastery of the bush. The engagement, when it came, was measured in seconds. A burst from an Owen submachine gun, a well-placed grenade, and the quick, decisive work of the Kukri if the fighting became hand-to-hand.
The Gurkhas would then disappear back into the green, moving miles away before the CTs could organize a response. The psychological effect on the communist guerrillas was devastating. They began to realize that they were no longer the masters of the night. The Gurkhas were everywhere and nowhere. They were the ghosts of the rubber trees. By the mid-1950s, the Gurkhas had refined this into a specialized unit, the Gurkha Independent Parachute Company. This was a Tier 1 asset, the precursor to modern special forces. They were trained in jungle tracking, halo, high altitude, low opening, parachuting, and advanced surveillance. They were the men who stayed behind enemy lines for months, mapping the insurgent networks and identifying the hidden supply bases. But the ultimate test of the Gurkha Special Operations capability came in 1962, in the dense, unmapped wilderness of Borneo. The Konfrontasi, the confrontation with Indonesia, was a shadow war fought across a 1,000-mile border between the Malaysian states of Sarawak and Sabah and Indonesian Kalimantan. The Indonesian leader, Sukarno, had launched a campaign of Ganyang Malaysia, crush Malaysia, sending thousands of regular and irregular troops across the border to destabilize the region. The British military command faced a terrifying logistical nightmare. The border was a line on a map that meant nothing in the jungle. The Indonesians could strike anywhere, retreat across the border into their sovereign territory, and be safe from British retaliation under international law. The British solution was Operation Claret. Operation Claret was one of the most successful and most classified special operations campaigns of the 20th century. It authorized British and Gurkha units to conduct preemptive cross-border raids into Indonesian territory. The rules were absolute. If you were killed or captured, your government would deny you. You carried no identification. You used non-British weapons where possible, and you left no evidence of your presence. The Gurkhas were the backbone of Operation Claret. They would move 10, 15, sometimes 20 kilometers into Indonesian Kalimantan. They would find the Indonesian river bases and the jungle camps where the incursions were being staged. The Kukri was the perfect weapon for Operation Claret. A gunshot in the jungle could be heard for miles, alerting every Indonesian patrol in the sector. A Kukri was silent. The Gurkhas would penetrate the Indonesian camps at night, execute the sentries, sabotage the boats and ammunition dumps, and exfiltrate back across the border before the sun rose. The Indonesians were baffled. They were losing officers and supplies in their own safe territory. They began to report that the British had supernatural troops who could walk through solid walls of vegetation and strike without making a sound. The success of Operation Claret was so absolute that Sukarno's military campaign eventually collapsed under the weight of its own internal paranoia. The border was secured, not by an army of thousands, but by a few hundred men in green hats who knew how to use the shadows. If you are a student of military history or a professional in the field, I would appreciate your insights in the comments regarding the ethics of cross-border deniable operations. Does the success of Operation Claret justify the violation of international sovereignty, or is it a dangerous precedent for modern conflict? Your likes and subscriptions ensure we can keep digging into these classified archives. As the Borneo conflict ended in 1966, the Gurkhas were at the peak of their professional capability. They had defeated 2 major insurgencies in 20 years. They had mastered the art of the small war. But the world was changing again. The British Empire was officially dead. The East of Suez policy was announced, meaning the British were withdrawing their permanent military presence from Asia and the Middle East. The Gurkha regiments were faced with another round of redundancies, the bureaucratic word for the firing of soldiers who had spent their lives bleeding for the crown. The Gurkha Brigade was cut in half once again. Thousands of men returned to their villages in Nepal, carrying their pensions and their kukris. They left behind a British military that was increasingly focused on the Cold War in Europe, on tanks in the North German plain, and nuclear deterrence in the Atlantic. To the planners in London, the Gurkha jungle fighter seemed like a romantic anachronism. They thought the era of the silent edge was over, replaced by the era of the digital soldier. They were wrong. In 1982, a conflict erupted in a cold, wind-swept archipelago in the South Atlantic, a landscape that was the polar opposite of the Malayan jungle. The Falkland Islands were about to become the stage for the most famous psychological operation in the history of the Gurkhas. The Argentine military, who had invaded the islands, were about to learn that the reputation of the Kukri was more dangerous than the blade itself. The 1st Battalion, 7th Duke of Edinburgh's own Gurkha Rifles, were ordered to join the task force. As they boarded the Queen Elizabeth II for the long voyage south, the British media began to leak stories about the bloodthirsty Gurkhas who were coming to the islands. The Argentine conscripts, huddled in their trenches on the heights of Mount Tumbledown and Mount William, began to hear rumours. They heard that the Gurkhas were coming to behead them. They heard that the Gurkhas didn't take prisoners. They heard that the Gurkhas sharpened their kukris with the whetstone of their enemies' bones. The Gurkhas did nothing to discourage these rumours. On the voyage, they spent hours on the decks of the ships, in full view of the cameras, sharpening their kukris with the chakmak. They smiled. They looked ready. The silent edge was about to cut through the morale of a professional Western army without ever drawing a drop of blood. The end of the 20th century is approaching, and the Gurkhas are moving from the jungle to the global stage of counter-terrorism and peacekeeping. But the greatest test of their loyalty is not a war, but a legal battle in the courts of London. Stay with us for Part 4, where we explore the battle for justice,
the Gurkhas' role in the War on Terror, and the incredible true story of a single Gurkha who fought off 30 Taliban insurgents in the darkness of an Afghan night. The blade is still sharp. The story is not over. It is a small bronze cross, measuring exactly 1.5 inches across, suspended from a crimson ribbon. It is cast from the metal of 2 Russian cannons captured at the siege of Sevastopol during the Crimean War in 1854. On its face is a lion standing upon the royal crown, with the simple words, "For Valor," inscribed beneath. It is the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration of the British Empire. To a professional soldier, it is the ultimate symbol of the contract between the individual and the state. The recognition that a man has reached the absolute limit of human courage and returned, or stayed, to pay the price. No unit in the history of the British military has earned more Victoria Crosses per capita than the Gurkhas. By the end of the 20th century, the Gurkha Brigade held 26 of these bronze crosses. But in the climate-controlled corridors of the Ministry of Defence in London in the late 1990s, the Victoria Cross was a legacy of an empire that no longer existed. The Gurkha was an administrative anomaly. To the accountants and the policymakers, the Gurkha was a foreign subject, serving under a unique tripartite agreement between Britain, India, and Nepal. This legal status allowed the British government to maintain the Gurkhas at a fraction of the cost of a regular British soldier.
In 1997, a Gurkha's pension was roughly 1/6 of that of his British counterpart. They were the most decorated soldiers in the army, yet they were not permitted to settle in the country they had spent 180 years defending. This was the collision between the old world of regimental honor and the new world of globalist bureaucracy. The Gurkha, who had mastered the jungle and the mountain, was now facing an enemy that could not be silenced by a Kukri, the legislative pen. But before the battle for justice reached the courts, the Gurkhas were called once again to the sharp end of British foreign policy. The Cold War had ended, but the world was entering an era of failed states and ethnic fragmentation. In 1999, the Gurkhas were deployed to Kosovo as part of the NATO peacekeeping force, KFOR. The environment was a haunting return to the vertical warfare of Italy and the Himalayas. The Balkan mountains were jagged, cold, and infested with landmines and snipers from the Yugoslav Army and the Kosovo Liberation Army. The 1st Royal Gurkha Rifles were among the first units to enter Kosovo. Their mission was to secure the mountain passes and protect the civilian population from ethnic cleansing. The psychological dynamic of the Gurkhas remained their most potent weapon. In the villages of Kosovo, the sight of a Gurkha patrol, short, stoic men moving with a quiet, lethal grace, had a calming effect on the civilians and a paralyzing effect on the local militias. The Serbian paramilitaries, who had developed a reputation for brutality, found that the Gurkhas were unimpressed by their theatrical violence. A Gurkha does not scream. He does not posture. He simply stands his ground, his hand resting near the hilt of his kukri, his eyes observing the surroundings with the clinical detachment of a mountain predator. The paramilitaries realized that if they pushed the Gurkha, the response would be immediate, absolute, and devoid of emotion.
If you are beginning to understand the intricate balance of psychological power and professional discipline that defines the Gurkha, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. We aim to respect the intelligence of our audience by providing an unvarnished, deep-dive analysis of the world's most elite military forces. In the comments, I'd be interested in your thoughts. Does the myth of a unit's lethality actually save lives by preventing conflict, or does it risk escalating it? Your engagement helps us continue producing these hour-long, research-heavy documentaries. The turn of the millennium brought the ultimate test of the Gurkhas' relevance in the 21st century: the global war on terror. In 2001, the United States and Britain invaded Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The landscape was a return to the roots of the Gurkha identity. The Hindu Kush mountains, the high-altitude deserts, and the intricate valley systems of Helmand and Kandahar were the closest environment to Nepal that the British Army had ever operated in. The British military machine in Afghanistan was a marvel of 21st century technology. The soldiers were equipped with SA-80A2 rifles, thermal optics, Osprey body armor, and real-time links to Reaper drones and Apache attack helicopters. But in the green zone of the Helmand River Valley, a maze of dense vegetation, irrigation ditches and mud-walled compounds, the technology failed. The heat reached 50 degrees Celsius. The dust clogged the sensors. The satellite links dropped in the deep canals. The war became once again a primitive struggle of endurance and observation. The Gurkhas were deployed to the front line of this conflict. They were tasked with compound clearing, the most dangerous type of infantry work. It involved entering fortified mud compounds, where a Taliban insurgent could be waiting behind every corner with an AK-47 or a suicide vest. This brings us to the story of Acting Sergeant Dipprasad Pun. On the night of September 17, 2010, Pun was on sentry duty at a small, isolated checkpoint in the Babaji area of Helmand province. He was alone on the roof of a single-story mud building when he heard a noise from the darkness below. Within seconds, the compound was under assault by a force of approximately 30 Taliban fighters armed with rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, and assault rifles. Pun's situation was mathematically terminal. He was outnumbered 30-1. The insurgents were attacking from all sides, throwing grenades onto the roof. In that moment, the thinking soldier of the mountains took over. Pun unleashed everything in his arsenal. He fired his SA-80 rifle until he had exhausted all his magazines. He fired his general-purpose machine gun until it jammed. He threw every grenade he had, 17 in total, to clear the base of the walls. When he ran out of conventional ammunition, the insurgents reached the roof. One fighter attempted to climb the ladder directly in front of him. Pun reached for his Kukri, but it was caught in his equipment. In a display of raw, primitive improvisation, he grabbed the heavy steel tripod of his machine gun and swung it like a mace. He struck the insurgent, knocking him off the roof, and screamed in Nepali, "I will kill you all!" For 15 minutes, Pun held the position alone. By the time reinforcements arrived, he had neutralized several insurgents and forced the rest to retreat. He had expended over 400 rounds of ammunition and 17 grenades. When he was awarded the conspicuous Gallantry Cross, just one level below the Victoria Cross, the citation noted his courage and presence of mind. But Pun, in his interview, was characteristically Gurkha. He said, "I thought I must die, so I decided to kill as many as I could before that happened." This is the psychological center peel at the level of a single individual.
It is the realization that once the contract of survival is broken, the only remaining objective is the absolute application of violence to protect the mission. But while the Gurkhas were bleeding in the mud of Helmand, a different kind of war was being fought in the courtrooms of London. The Gurkha Justice Campaign, led by the actress Joanna Lumley, whose own father had been an officer in the 6th Gurkha Rifles, brought the plight of the veterans to the British public. The contrast was too sharp for the government to hide. On the evening news, the public saw men like Dipprasad Pun fighting 30-1 in Afghanistan. On the front page of the newspapers, they saw 80-year-old Victoria Cross winners being denied the right to live in the UK and living in poverty in Nepal. The British government, led by the Home Office, attempted to fight the campaign with bureaucratic inertia. They argued that the Gurkhas were mercenaries and that allowing them to settle in Britain would be a logistical and financial burden. The public reaction was a tidal wave of outrage. The British people, who often felt a disconnect from their own military, saw the Gurkhas as the last bastion of a lost world of loyalty and stoicism.
They saw the Kukri not as a foreign weapon, but as a British icon. In 2009, the government finally surrendered. The High Court ruled that the Gurkhas had earned the right to settle in the United Kingdom. It was a victory won not with the blade, but with the moral weight of 200 years of service. If you are finding this investigation into the social and political evolution of the world's most loyal soldiers compelling, please hit the like button and ensure you are subscribed. It is vital to examine the cost of loyalty and the friction between those who fight the wars and those who manage the peace.
In the comments, I would be interested in your thoughts. Does a nation owe a greater debt to those who serve it from the outside than to its own citizens?
The modern Gurkha is now a hybrid being. He is a British citizen. He lives in the garrison towns of Shorncliffe and Aldershot. His children go to British schools and speak with British accents. He uses the latest digital technology on the battlefield and navigates the complex social landscape of a modern Western democracy. But every year, the Galawalas still go into the mountains of Nepal. They still recruit the boys who carry the doko baskets. They still filter for the 1% who can endure the impossible. The Kukri hanging on the belt of a Gurkha in 2024 is the same steel as the one carried in 1814. The notch at the base of the blade still represents the sacred cow. The edge is still sharpened with the chakmak. As we enter the final part of our series, we will examine the future of the silent edge. In a world of autonomous drones, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare, is there still a place for a man with a knife? We will look at the Gurkha's role in the elite SAS and the secret missions of the specialist Gurkha units that operate in the most sensitive regions of the world today. The war is changing. The machine is becoming faster and more invisible, but the heart of the mountain soldier remains the same. The final lesson of the Gurkha is not about the blade. It is about the man who holds it. Stay with us for the conclusion. The edge is silent, but its story is timeless. In the modern military installations of the 21st century, the digital and the analog exist in a state of uneasy, overlapping tension. A brigade of Gurkhas operator in 2024 carries a loadout that would be unrecognizable to the men who climbed the heights of Sari Bear or Hangman's Hill. He wears an integrated communications headset that filters out the roar of the battlefield while amplifying the whisper of a teammate. His body armor is a modular system of ceramic and Kevlar, designed to stop a high-velocity rifle round at point-blank range. He carries a tactical tablet on his forearm that displays real-time satellite feeds and the GPS coordinates of every friendly and enemy unit within a 5-kilometer radius. Yet, tucked into the small of his back, positioned for a quick draw in a confined space, is a sheath containing the Kukri. This is the central paradox of the modern Gurkha. In an era of over-the-horizon capabilities, where a drone operator in a climate-controlled room in Nevada can strike a target in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, the British military still maintains a dedicated brigade of soldiers who are primarily defined by their mastery of the last meter. The last meter is the space where technology fails. It is the dark hallway of a compound in Helmand, the dense undergrowth of a jungle in Belize, or the freezing silence of a trench in a future European conflict. It is the space where the outcome of the war is decided not by the speed of the processor or the range of the missile, but by the physical and psychological resilience of a human being. To understand why the silent edge remains the ultimate force multiplier in the 21st century, one must look past the standard infantry battalions and examine the elite specialized units into which the modern Gurkha has evolved. The most enigmatic of these is the Gurkha contingent of the Singapore Police Force. While technically separate from the British Army, the GC is recruited from the same hills in Nepal through the same grueling selection process. They are the ultimate Praetorian Guard of one of the world's most advanced city-states. They guard the most sensitive diplomatic installations, the most critical infrastructure, and the leaders of the nation. The Singaporean government a global leader in artificial intelligence and surveillance technology, pays a premium for the Gurkha. Why? Because a Gurkha possesses a quality that no algorithm can replicate: absolute, incorruptible neutrality. In a multi-ethnic, hyper-modern society, the Gurkha is the outsider, the silent, stoic observer who is beholden to no political faction and no local grievance. He is the human manifestation of the thinking soldier, an individual who can stand guard for 12 hours in the sweltering tropical heat without moving, without complaining, and without losing his focus. The Kukri on his belt is the symbol of this discipline. It is a warning that beneath the professional, polite exterior of the modern security officer is a warrior whose lineage is defined by the absolute application of violence. If you are finding this final chapter in our investigation into the world's most elite brotherhood profound, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. We aim to honor the complexity of military history and the individuals who carry its weight. In the comments, I would be interested in your final thoughts on this series. In an era of increasingly autonomous warfare, is the human warrior spirit still a relevant asset? Or are we witnessing the final generation of the individual soldier? Your feedback is the whetstone that sharpens our future content. The second evolution of the modern Gurkha is his integration into the highest echelons of British Special Operations. Since the late 20th century, the Special Air Service, SAS, and the Special Boat Service, SBS, have seen an increasing number of Gurkha applicants. To pass the SAS selection, the legendary long walk through the Brecon Beacons is a feat that breaks 90% of the British Army's best soldiers. But for a Gurkha, the Brecon Beacons are not intimidating. They are merely smaller, wetter versions of the hills he grew up in. The Gurkha brings a unique psychological profile to the SAS. While a Western Special Forces operator is often a highly individualized, high-ego personality, the Gurkha is defined by a collective stoicism. He does not seek the spotlight, he does not write memoirs or seek fame on social media. He operates in the gray zone, where the lines between peace and war are blurred. In recent, largely classified operations in North Africa and the Middle East, Gurkha operators within the SAS have been utilized for their cultural adaptability and their linguistic capability. A Gurkha can blend into a high-altitude village in the mountains of Central Asia or a desert outpost in the Sahel with an ease that a Western operator cannot match. His physiology, his diet, and his innate understanding of tribal dynamics make him the perfect gray zone asset. But even at the Tier 1 level, the Kukri remains. It is not just for combat, it is for the contract. We must return to the metaphor of the cowdy, the notch at the base of the blade. As we noted at the beginning of this analysis, the notch represents the footprint of the cow. It is a spiritual boundary. It reminds the warrior that while he is trained for the intimacy of the kill, he is still connected to a sacred moral order. It is the boundary between the soldier and the murderer. In the modern world, this moral boundary is under continuous assault. The industrialization of death has made killing a sterile, distant process. A pilot dropping a bomb from 30,000 feet does not see the faces of the people he kills. He does not smell the cordite. He does not feel the resistance of the blade. The Gurkha, however, remains anchored in the physical reality of combat. The Kukri requires him to get close. It requires him to take personal responsibility for the act of violence. This creates a psychological grounding that many modern veterans of drone warfare or long-range artillery lack. The Gurkha's trauma is intimate, but so is his sense of duty. This leads us to the final and perhaps most profound transformation of the Gurkha: the return to the mountains. When a modern Gurkha retires from the British Army after 22 years of service, he returns to Nepal with more than just a pension and a British passport. He returns as a leader of his community. The money sent home by Gurkhas is the single largest source of foreign currency for the Nepalese economy. It builds the schools, the hospitals, and the irrigation systems of the Himalayas. The boy who once ran the Doko race with 25 kilograms of rocks in his basket is now the man who funds the education of the next generation of doctors and engineers in Kathmandu. The weight he carried in the mountains was not just a test of his lungs, it was the foundation of his nation's future. The contract between the British Crown and the Gurkha people has evolved. It began as an imperial necessity, a way for a global power to utilize the raw strength of a mountain people. It moved through the crucible of 2 world wars, the jungles of Malaya, and the mud of Afghanistan. It survived the bureaucratic betrayals and the legal battles in London. Today, the contract is a symbol of a shared history that transcends colonialism. It is a recognition that even in the most technologically advanced society, the ultimate force multiplier is the human being who has been selected, trained, and hardened to a point of absolute reliability. As we look toward the future of conflict, toward the possibility of peer-to-peer wars, cyber sabotage, and the collapse of the digital infrastructure, the Gurkha remains the insurance policy of the British state. If the satellites are blinded, if the radios are jammed, if the power grid fails, the British military knows it still has a brigade of men who can navigate by the stars, survive on the land, and hold the line with a blade and a compass. The silent edge is not a relic of the past. It is a requirement for the future.
If this flagship documentary has changed your understanding of the relationship between tradition and technology in the modern military, please ensure you are subscribed. We are dedicated to providing the most detailed, objective, and intellectually rigorous military content on this platform. Your support allows us to continue digging into the archives and interviewing the veterans who lived these stories. As the sun sets over the Annapurna Range, a young boy is practicing his lunges in a dirt clearing. He has no shoes, and his ribs show through his tattered shirt. But in his hand, he holds a wooden practice kukri, carved by his father. He is not thinking about the British Empire or the global war on terror. He is thinking about the Doko race. He is thinking about the honor of his family. He is thinking about the silence of the mountain passes. He is the raw steel, waiting for the forge. The history of the Gurkhas is a cycle of sharpening. The mountain forges them, the selection filters them, the training tempers them, and the war tests them. But the final result is always the same. A human being who can endure what others cannot, who can do what machines cannot, and who remains loyal when everything else falls apart. The kukri is oiled. The edge is realigned with the chakmak. The soldier is ready. The machine of the 21st century continues to roar, faster and louder than ever before. But in the shadows of the last meter, the edge remains silent. And as long as there is a need for a man to walk into the dark, to sit in the cold, and to watch the enemy with the patience of a predator, the Gurkha will be there. Because for the Gurkha, the impossible is merely a standard. Better to die than be a coward. The motto remains. The blade remains. The man remains. Thank you for watching this complete history of the silent edge. The story of the Gurkhas is a story of the human spirit's refusal to be replaced by the machine. It is a story that proves, once and for all, that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is not the one that costs billions of dollars, but the one that is forged in the mountains and carried in the heart. The edge is silent. The mission is complete. Stay ready.